in the environment as I started traveling and looking at the world around me. I never got to Antarctica, but I did get near there to some islands called the Sub-Antarctic Islands south of New Zealand, and did see some penguins, both in New Zealand and in these islands, but not the ones we're going to be mostly talking about today. But I'm not going to just talk about penguins. In fact, I'm going to talk about a lot more, and we'll get to that later. Um, so this talk is put together from two sources that I've mentioned over on the left. The Science magazine is a weekly magazine put out by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and it's a fairly rigorous scientific journal. Um, and they've done some articles not too long ago about Antarctica, and I found them quite interesting. And then some of the more pictorial pictures are from the National Geographic, and I found that magazine to be increasingly interesting with the years. They seem to take quite an interest in educating the public about climate awareness than some magazines. And I'm really pleased to see that in their editorial policy. So we'll start off with some science articles and then go to the rather pretty National Geographic. Before we go there, I want to tantalize you a little bit. These are emperor penguins in the basic slide, and that is some um, overlying ice, of course, on a shelf of ice in Antarctica. And these penguins are going out for a swim. It's early in the morning, but there's enough, the sun is high enough to light the surface of the water, which you can see there. And so they're going out for a swim, and they eat a lot of krill and other small fish. Krill, of course, is not a fish, but a arthropod, and so but it's a very important food source for them as well as other small fish. I shouldn't say other small fish, just small fish. And I'll bring to your attention those little bubble-like clouds. Those are that you see on the surface. That's not air. Those are clouds of phytoplankton and regular plankton, zooplankton it's called. So some of them are somewhat photosynthetic, and so they're using the sunlight there. And they're also krill in a close association with them. And in those clouds of food, that's just a lunchtime for those, or a nice breakfast time for those penguins that are using their flippers as wings to fly. Well, they're birds, so there are their wings, but they're used like a whale's flipper to fly, swim through the water for their breakfast. So the other thing in the picture that I'll tell you about later is those airstreams. Those you can see down at the bottom of the picture, one of the penguins is accelerating from his normal speed of 8 miles an hour to about 15 because he's ready to do something kind of interesting. We'll see those in the slides that follow. So this is Antarctica. I'm going to try and minimize these pictures up here a little bit so that we can see that better. And you can see Antarctica is really almost two continents. It's you'll see a little bit later that it's really one, but we can think of it as two continents. That part to the east of the central trans-Antarctic mountains, that you see there, the large part that's all white, that is a lot of land above sea level. And there are mountains there, there's some volcanoes. There's a lot of glacial ice there, and that's going to take a long time to melt. We don't notice I said a long time. Nobody really knows how long, but it is a vast water reservoir that has melted in the past and frozen in the past through the cycles that the Earth has taken. The West Antarctica is a glorified ice shelf with some high regions, and then there's a mountainous region off to the left called the Antarctic Peninsula. It's kind of a broad name, and that connects with the Andes in South America. And I'll show you that in the next slide or so, just so you can see the relationships with the other continents. You can see a scale there in miles down at the bottom. And notice you can see the Ross Ice Shelf off the Ross Sea. And This name is an important one here, Bellinghausen Sea. Antarctica was discovered 200 years ago by Bellinghausen. Sounds like a German name, but he's a Russian. And so that sea, just 200 years ago this year, discovered Antarctica. James Cook, was looking for it. He'd heard about this Terra Australis in the south, and he hunted for it for quite a while. Did some detailed cruising around the Southern Ocean, but was always repelled by ice and other problems different times of the year, and never actually saw solid ground. And so he came back more than 200 years ago, about 220 or 30 years ago, and said to everybody, I think it's a myth. And so that's sort of the mythical land which turned up as a result of Bellinghausen. So the next slide will show us these continents, as I promised to you. You can see again the Atlantic Peninsula here, obviously connected to the Andes in South America. This is distorted because the geographic lines cause distortion. Off of East Antarctica, there's a bit of Southern Atlantic, Africa, the Indian Ocean, and Australia off of those. Now this is Mount Erebus, a volcano on Ross Island, and I can show you its location right here. There's a little tiny island in the Ross Sea, just about there. And that has an important volcano. It's not the largest and not the biggest mountain, but it's pretty impressive. And because of its proximity to Christchurch here in New Zealand, they used to take some flights, and you could just take a couple of hours and you'd zip around here and fly back home again. It was a rather popular thing for the tourists to do in the day. But back in 1979, in November, Flight 901 crashed there, flew right into it at full speed with 257 people on board, including the pilot and air crew. And that was, don't know if many of you recall that. It was not a lot made into it, but it was a huge aircraft accident, as most accidents are, caused by both some problems at the home base in pre-planning, and also the pilots had never flown there before. You would think they might have, but they had flown other places and were fairly experienced, but they had not flown to this location before, neither one of them. And so they flew right into it because they were in whiteout conditions. It was a beautiful sunny day. People in the plane were taking pictures down where they could see Antarctica very nicely, but the pilots were fooled and they flew right into the base of this volcano. It's sort of a shock. But it just goes to show we have to be careful with our tourism, just as we have been with this Boeing jet a while ago that's just being renovated now. Coming back to the topography, I mentioned to you that East Antarctica is much more above the sea level. So this tomography that they do of Antarctica shows the blue areas are marine based below sea level. And the sheet grounding line is plotted in white here, where the ice sheet grinds to, and the end of the ice sheet is in the black line here. So you can see a little bit, get an idea of the anatomy of this world's largest reservoir of fresh water. It amounts to about 2% of all the water on the planet, and that's a lot of fresh water. The rest of the fresh water that's circulating around the planet is clouds and rain, represents 1% of the Earth's water. So 97% of the Earth's water is salt water in the oceans, and 1% is raining on us and evaporating and raining, and 2%, twice the circulating water, is here in Antarctica. So, and I guess you'd have to add, come to think of it, Greenland to that. I have been to Greenland, by the way, and the picture that you may have sent around, Paul, is a picture I thought appropriate. That was when I was in Greenland, which was quite different from Antarctica, but a wonderful place to visit. Moving on to this one, it won't take long here, but just to mention that in 100 million years, not much has happened there. It was once a tree-covered continent. Then it changed to one in ice. But in the last 70 years, things have happened a lot. The last sentence shows that sea ice appears later and disappears faster. The ice-free season on the Western Peninsula, that's the type that's mostly floating, lasts a full 90 days longer than it did 40 years ago. So that's a lot longer. That would be equivalent to summer suddenly ending at Christmas time. So that would be a big change if it were happening here. And that's just happened over the last 70 years or so. This is more of a cutaway of Antarctica. And here you see this western part. Some of this purplish area here are the ice shelves that extend out over the ocean, and they are naturally melting faster. These ones shown here in red are being investigated quite a lot. This one's called Thwaites Glacier, and that's quite exciting. And so are these areas. You've probably heard in the news about these glaciers here. These are the various ice sheets along this area of the Antarctic Peninsula. Here is more over in the eastern part. You see a cutaway showing the continent underneath a pretty thick layer, 13 feet of on the average of ice over those mountains. You can see a close-up here, although it still doesn't show up very well, of the Ross Island where that Mount Erebus volcano is lying. This shows the levels that the oceans would go up. I'll go into that later. Should all this ice melt, it would almost drown out the Empire State, the Statue of Liberty. Here's another look at it where we get an idea of the currents. There's an Antarctic circumpolar current that goes in a clockwise fashion, and then you have these two gyres with the G here, allowing greater melting where the water goes around in circles, and you can see the ice shelves here, and the degree of melting is shown in millimeters per year. So 7 millimeters per year in this area, and that's the western part. You don't see nearly that rapid, more like 3 millimeters. And some of that is seasonal, where it's a brighter yellow. And the lighter, more beigey yellow is losing 3 millimeters. I'm sorry, not millimeters, those are meters, I beg your pardon, meters per year. And that's permanent loss. So, but it's much more prevalent here on the Western Antarctica. They've done a study in more detail of the Larsen ice shelves here up in the Arctic Peninsula, showing how they have melted and where they were in various years. This is from the Science article. This is the Amundsen Sea, and in that area, here you have a couple of glaciers, the Pine Island Glacier, the Thwaites, and others. And you can see their fairly rapid rates in meters per year of change, and it's graphed out here between 2002 and 2018. So they're seeing this evolution. Some of this is done by gravity recovery and climate experiments done from space, and it's called GRACE for short. Okay, leaving science behind and now going to the National Geographic. This is one of their vessels, and it's somebody's taken imagine they have a helicopter or a drone, one or the other. They've taken a very nice shot of their ship. They're cruising along. There can be some nice weather there as well as not so nice weather. This is another lovely shot of the beauty in Antarctica. I saw images like this in Greenland as well, where glaciers are melting and you get a warm spot and you can look right through these magnificent tunnels. Another one here, beautiful framed view in Antarctica. You can even get green icebergs here. The reason for that is they're not, it's not all chlorophyll. That is mostly particulate matter that is there of a particular size that lends the sun's rays to change in the spectrum in its reflected light, and so that it gives the shade of green. Now this is the krill that I talked about. Lots of other critters eat it. Fish, squid, penguins, and seals, and whales consume it as well, particularly the baleen whales. It's a very important base of the food chain of the oceans. And ships from various countries come to Antarctica just to net the swarming krill by the billions. They haven't been able to demonstrate any losses of it, but it just stands to reason as we continue to use krill. We use it for some of our fish oil supplements, and we all like that. It's good for us, but the more we mine the stuff, eventually we will start to see the population of those go down. So we need to have some regulation, and at the moment there's next to none. There's some, but not enough. People think of Antarctica as being rather barren, but there are beautiful creatures under the ocean. You can see the ice above, and this is a feather star, which is related to a starfish and a sand dollar, but it's another member of that echinoderm family. And this is not a plant, of course, even though it looks plant-like. It's an animal just like a starfish, but a rather pretty one. And this shows octopus. This one is jetting along the seabed. There are lots of them there. There's 16 different species of octopus. All have specialized pigment in their blood called hemocyanin, the same as the horseshoe crabs. It turns the blood blue and helps them survive subfreezing temperatures. Now this ice fish there are 3 different kinds of ice fish. This one is the cod-like ice fish, and it doesn't have hemocyanin. It has a different way of keeping its blood from freezing. It makes a sort of a glycoprotein antifreeze that keeps. So it's a red-blooded animal, or fish, I mean, but it's among some ancient kelp, and so they're even fish down there. Now here are the penguins. There are quite a number of species. There are 18 on the planet, I believe, and these are 9 that live in the Antarctic area. Only one of which I think has breeds and has their eggs there, and that's the emperor penguin that we've heard so much about. They vary quite a bit in size. If you want to imagine, this bird is generally about 4 feet high and about 70 pounds. The king penguin, which are a little harder to recognize, they're a little different in coloring, a little more pigment here below the head, and about 2/3 as tall. So they'd be about 2.5 feet tall. A little more pigment here in the upper chest, but a rather similar bird. This is the Gentoo penguin with this little white cap. Nobody seems to remember how it got its name. People thought it might be related to some interpretations of turbans, and so they called it the Gentoo, which has a similar origin. The Adélie penguin, of course, is a French name, and the chin strap has this cute little line under its chin. These 3 are doing relatively well. The chin strap is going, this arrows indicate whether the population trend is going up or down. The Adélie seem to be thriving in some places. This one might be going down in some, but these 3, as a rule, are doing reasonably well. The king seems to be doing fairly well. Nobody seems to quite know about the emperors because they've been seen to disappear in some areas and pop up in others. Probably these ones, the macaroni and the are most vulnerable. And the royal penguin seems to be endangered. This is still a big question mark, but they're fascinating animals, or birds, I mean. And this is a close-up of the emperor penguin, and they say they're about 4 feet tall and 50 to 100 pounds. Now, this is the story I promised to tell you. They take, when they want to leave the ocean, they have a hard time getting out onto the ice shelf without propelling themselves. And so how do they get this air to do this? They make several dives. They come up to the surface, get some air, but they don't put the air in their lungs. They somehow get it under their wings, and it seems to catch around their feathers. And as they come up to the surface, they sort of spread their wings, catch this air, and then they go down, and then they just squeeze it out. They have muscles just like sort of compressing your hair, your hair follicles, and they can squeeze their feathers, and this air comes rushing out. It can accelerate from 8 to about 50 miles an hour on a rocket out of the water. And you see their bellies are kind of filled out to act as a cushion when they land with their 70 pounds of weight on this hard ice. And that's their standard way of getting out of the water after their breakfast swim. I think it's pretty incredible, and I would never have known that until I did watch some people staying down there and taking videos of them, and that picture is taken from a video shot. It's fascinating if you go online and Google something like that to see how they actually do that. Um, I only show this picture to remind you that there are some fossilized emperor penguins that were found recently that lived 37 million years ago. And instead of being 4 feet tall, these ones, not the ones pictured here, but similar to that, were 6.5 feet tall. So we've had not only ancient birds that were quite large living on land in places like Australia, but we also had some giant penguins many years ago. Here's a close-up of the Gentoo penguin, rather cute with the little white spots on their head. And the chin straps are plunging into danger because they're a smaller penguin, and the certain types of seals that I'll show you in a few minutes just love to have them for lunch. Here it is, the leopard seal, you can see on the lower center. And the Adelie penguins are hiding one. There's one little one that just about got caught, and he's going to jump up and climb up and be with his friends, and he just missed him. So he's a lucky Adelie for the moment. This is some pictures of an Adelie seal. The leopard seals nips at the young ones, and they drag them down and drown them. And if they're just drowned passively, that's probably to their benefit, but sometimes they don't die immediately, and in which case the leopard seal bangs them around in the water so swiftly that it literally skins them alive. And these half-ton predators then consume them after they've been toying with them for a while. It must be an awful way to go. This human with a big camera here faces a leopard seal who looks pretty aggressive, but I think he feels that the camera is not a good lunch. And so humans have not had a problem with the leopard seals to the best of my knowledge. Here are these Adelies. I'm saying we'll have to adapt or else because they're surrounded here oftentimes by these leopard seals. This is just a shot of the relative size of an emperor penguin. It looks a little bigger there compared to the human and maybe a little bit further away, swimming along an ice shelf. But I think it's an interesting picture of the big bubbles of phytoplankton and krill floating, and then the ice just below that, and these two swimmers. Wonderful that we have equipment that we can go down and appreciate how these wonderful birds fly through the water. Somebody found a mummy in melting snow, and here on the left, you can see the remains of a very small penguin that just didn't make it, and it became mummified in the cold. And this picture here shows the area where the nests are built and what they look like. The nests, they pick little balls, little stones about the same size, and the males will often make very nice little nests of these beautifully arranged stones for their mates to approve before they settle down and lay eggs on the gravel there. This is a helicopter that landed where they were searching for this mummy that they found. I wanted to tell you a little bit about other birds of Antarctica. On the left, we see the wandering albatross. There are quite a few different species of albatross. They sometimes get up into the northern hemisphere, but the majority of their activity is in the southern oceans. Over on the far right here, we have shearwaters. They're very common in New Zealand, but they also do exist elsewhere in the southern oceans. This is one of my favorite little petrels. Petrel, of course, I think comes from Peter, who is thought to have walked on the water. And some of these petrels, I'll show you in a next picture, sometimes skip along the water, and I thought it's a cute way they got their name. This particular petrel is called the painted petrel, and at night they love to fly next to ships, and on the hope that something will fall overboard for them to feed on. They are all very good hunters and have a wonderful sense of smell. They have tremendous open nostrils here, and some of them call them tube noses because they can smell fish, sometimes even flying fish right next to the surface, and are ready to catch them as they fly small distances above the water. Here is a picture of the petrel here, sort of walking along the water. A beautiful shearwater here sort of a hooded shearwater, beautiful expression and way he's flying along. I just love the background waves. And this one, the albatross have a harder time getting off the water. They're a big, heavy bird, and they really need to stick where there's enough wind. They prefer about a 30-mile-an-hour headwind to take off into. It helps them to get off the water. Otherwise, if they're becalmed, they could be there for a while. That's one of the reasons I think why they like the southern oceans. The winds around the southern oceans blow about 30 miles an hour, 24/7. Just some bones of blue whales along the coast. There was the whaling industry really depleted the whale population, and it went down to about 5% of what it once was, but it's coming back, fortunately. And they did some recent studies. This was from a fairly recent article, and it shows that 55 blue whales were found in many humpbacks off South Georgia, one of the subantarctic islands. And they were really pleased to see the number 790 humpbacks were found during a 3-week survey. So that's encouraging. A curious young Weddell seal, just weeks old, comes in for a close-up look at the photographer. It may have been a pup from the last season, says the photographer, a marine biologist, Pierre Chevaldanet. And he worked at a Weddell at a base called Diamant d'Urville, and has done some of the magnificent photography for National Geographic that you see here. This is another one of a Weddell seal and her pup. So finally, before we leave the subject, I want to just review with you how much water is in this wonderful continent. Well, the western sheet here, they call it an ice sheet, or WAIS, has the potential to raise the sea level by 5.3 meters. That's pretty inconvenient for people who live close to the ocean. If you think about it, about the southern half of Florida is probably about 5.3 meters above the ocean, meter being a little over 3 feet, so that's about 16 feet. And that's probably going to melt this century. And so the people of Miami who consider to vote in such a way as to ignore or think that climate change is a myth might be regretful, at least their grandchildren might be, because it's going to be inconvenient when that melts, not just for Miami, but for a lot of cities across Asia and elsewhere in the world when the oceans go up by that much. Now, nobody, although they've made predictions, and their predictions are usually pretty conservative. Again and again, scientists say, well, we wanted to be careful. We didn't want to overdo it or be too extreme in our views. So we played it cautiously. But unfortunately, the public has been lulled a little bit like that. And they're finding to their surprise that scientists are saying, hey, we underestimated. It's really worse than what we thought. But for East Antarctica, nobody has a clue. It depends very much on the feedbacks that we have, melting permafrost in the northern Russia and northern Canada. How rapidly would that methane being released contribute to further climate change? We don't know how rapidly that would happen. So it could be a few centuries, or it could be maybe just a couple of centuries. We don't know. But when it happens, that's going to be pretty bad, because 52 meters is a lot of feet and a lot of water going to be released. So we will have some loss of salinity of the oceans as all that water goes in, but we will, with all the CO2 that'll accumulate, that will become acidic, and that will destroy the food chain. So we've got some serious problems here, even though it's a beautiful place to visit. I present it to you as an interesting place to represent to us the beauty and the cycles of the earth warming but we are warming this continent far, far faster than any of the natural cycles that have occurred over the millions of years. We are doing it in just a few hundred years. So this is our goodbye to Antarctica, and I will be happy to entertain your questions. Let's see here if I can. Screen sharing. Okay. There we go. Now,
Roz, my question is, are there any?
Yes, question. I was curious, a couple of things. You talked about the green ice, and presumably that's due to particle size of something in the ice. What is it in the ice that makes it green?
I don't know. I think you put your finger on it as much as I know. It was particle size.
It could be fairly easy to chip off some of it, melt it, and find out, what that material is.
I guess it would be, and somebody must have done it, but that didn't get in my article.
Okay, and then I'm interested in the macaroni penguins.
Yes.
And I first encountered, macaroni. I was in grade school growing up, and they're talking about Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Yep. And I'm thinking, what does that have to do with Italian noodles, pasta? But I didn't learn until much later when I was learning how to sail that there's a boat rig called macaroni rig. And back apparently in that time period, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the word macaroni was commonly used to mean something fancy or ornate. And that little penguin looked like he was kind of like fancy. So I wonder if he got his name from being fancy rather than from being like an Italian pasta.
He has quite a rig on his hair, on his top knot. And I think it really does look like macaroni. I didn't see the macaroni penguin, but I saw one very similar to that in an island called the Snare Islands, which are just south of New Zealand. And they were called rockhoppers, those penguins, but they had a similar kind of feathers on the top of their head. So I think it just resembled the Italian food. But thank you for sharing about the macaroni rig. I did not know about that. I'll watch for that. Does it look pretty bizarre?
Yeah. One other question about the albatrosses.
Yeah.
They're actually able to take off from the water in heavy winds. They're very, I don't know how those birds get in the air, but on Midway Island, the Navy built an air base there.
Yes.
And the albatross would use the runways from the naval, from the air station to take off. They can get to running down a runway and beating their wings, and it takes them quite a while to get up enough speed to actually lift off, even when they have a paved runway. Yes. And the sailors there call them goonie birds because they look so awkward when they're running down the runway.
They do.
I without having a paved runway, I was wondering how else those birds can get into the air. But you say that if they have a 30-mile-an-hour headwind, they can actually do it off the water.
They can. If you go to the Galapagos Islands anytime, Floriana has a lovely cliff, one of the southernmost of the Galapagos Islands, and the albatross there mate and lay eggs, and the young ones are all covered with down, and they look very much like goonie birds with this fluff on them. But eventually they get up the nerve and they come to a cliff, and there's a big cliff on Floriana, right into the headwinds that tend to come out of the north there. And they just jump off when they feel they're ready to, and away they go, and probably won't see them for another year or so before they get back. And some of them can gather food from flying fish that they can smell and sort of sense with these incredible tube noses, so they don't have to actually land sometimes to get fish. They're not like a skimmer, which has a special bill, of course, to gather fish near the surface, but they have a tremendous ability to gather fish without landing in the water. But eventually they do, but they only will land where they know that there's enough wind so they can take off. And they have to kind of waddle along the water for a little ways and use their feet to help them launch. They've got wonderful long wings, but they're a reasonably heavy bird, so that it's a little harder for them to get off the water than a shearwater or a petrel. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful birds down there. I enjoy birds a lot, so it helps enjoy my travels more when I'm understand the birds where I'm visiting.
Richard, is there any kind of a scientific base for people to live there and do research?
Yes, there are several bases in Antarctica. Um, some of them, many of them are, I shouldn't say many of them, at least about half or more are occupied only part of the year, but there are a few that are occupied year round. I think those are usually still, it's kind of like the International Space Station. I think people only go down there for probably about 6 months at a time. And so they, but there are a few people who stay, there are some people on Antarctica at all times of the year, but the people who are there over the Arctic winter, which is our summer, of course, um, they're pretty much indoors, and they do only get out for fairly short periods of time. So you can get almost as confined as if you're in an International Space Station, and I don't think they stay for more than 6 months at a time. I don't know of any permanent habitations there, though. No, no. But and they have made a point. There's a treaty, international treaty signed by all the countries of the world to make a proclamation that no country will try to take advantage and dominate Antarctica. And this is a nice thing to happen. There were some attempts by England to ask for a chunk of the northwest corner, and that was turned down by the other countries. So it's still an international um, resource to help understand climate change, because it is Greenland, of course, is important as well, and other parts of the planet. But for understanding climate change, it's a good marker, like a canary in the coal mine.
Did you give us the answer as to the southernmost existence of the penguins? You asked that at the, or we were talking about that at the beginning before we started. I don't remember if you gave us an answer. I think Marilyn had guessed.
I think, oh,
The Galapagos Islands, and it was the
I'm sorry.
northernmost.
Now I got it. Yes, the Galapagos and are the northernmost penguins. They don't come further north of the equator than the Galapagos Islands. So that was the answer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The just to deal with the other thing about the penguins, only the emperor penguin breeds year round. Well, not year round, but they are there. The males look after the eggs and the chicks, as you've undoubtedly seen in some of those wonderful movies of the emperor penguins. And but they're there. They're the only one of the 18 species of penguin who live year round, right on the ice. The other ones just come there at certain times when it's nicer weather, and in the islands around there. Now, when we were in New Zealand, we went to South Island and Christchurch. Just off of Christchurch, there's a lovely little biological station, and they have yellow-eyed penguins that just wander all around that area. And they're kind of aggressive, but they're much. They don't seem to need any ice, and so they just hang out in New Zealand, and people run across them from time to time.
Richard, were there are ever any indigenous people living in Antarctica or traveling there on any kind of regular basis, seasonally perhaps?
No, I think indigenous doesn't apply to Antarctica. There might have been indigenous people before it iced over, but that would be millions of years ago, and I'm not sure that we even had Homo sapiens at that time. So I think the early explorers who discovered Antarctica were the very first humans to set foot there. Yeah.
What is the actual temperature range in Antarctica?
Yeah, that's a good thing to mention. I'm not very good on the air temperatures, but the water temperature was expressed as ranging from various depths and locations around, ranging from about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius below zero to a couple of degrees above. The air temperatures, I think, depending on the storms and the winds, would probably get down to 60 or 70 below zero centigrade or Celsius. But I don't know the details of the air temperatures.
What would be the warmest summer day that you might experience on land?
That's a good question also, and I'm not positive of that, but I think it will get up to somewhere around in the what we would say, and I'll switch to Fahrenheit now, because I'm accustomed to that with relating to our temperatures. I think it might get up to around 20 on a very warm day. I'm not sure that it ever gets above 20 that I'm aware of. There might be a little bit of melting in some areas where the sun is fairly high around noon. You might have a little bit of reflection from light and a wee bit of melting here and there. And there's obviously some seasonal melting of the ice where the temperature of the water gets above zero Celsius. But in the air, I would think it would be brief and still mostly below freezing.
Is there any kind of tourist interest in Antarctica?
Yes, there are tourists who come down and ask to visit usually the research stations. The majority of the tourists just go to the Arctic Peninsula, which, as you noticed, is close to South America. And some of the people who decide to visit the southern parts of Chile or Argentina, they will take a little side trip to the Arctic Peninsula to say that they've been to Antarctica. But it's a very different world, I think, from a little sojourn during the Arctic summer to the depths of Antarctica. So it's a little extension where you can say if you're a tourist, well, I've been there. But I think tourism to the rest of the continent would be mostly restricted to people who had a scientific bent, not your average tourist, to endure some of the hardships of that. But we did travel with a group called Zagram, Zeagraham, out of Seattle. And they did specialize in Antarctic trips, and they went a little further in, but they wanted me to go with them, but I declined. And I was just happy enough to go to the subantarctic islands. So I don't know exactly where they take their trips, but I think they do go, some of these specialist trips do take you deeper in beyond the Arctic Peninsula, but I'm not exactly sure where.
What does the night sky look like down there?
What's that? Can you say that again?
What is the night sky? The sky.
Night sky.
Night sky.
Southern Crossby straight
Yeah.
overhead.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I've been kind of in the last slide. Although you have to remember that when you're, depending on exactly where you are in Antarctica, how close you are to the South Pole, that night sky that I showed you in the last slide could be in the daytime. What we would call a daytime, it would be maybe high noon there, and the sun just barely gets above the horizon. Sometimes doesn't for a long time. But most of their winter, the sun doesn't, come up to the horizon at all, and it's just black. And so they will have long days in the winter when the sun will come up for, maybe as long as our days are in the winter, and then in their winter they just don't see the sun for 6 months or so at all. So it's just a pitch black sky. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if that's what you meant.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I wondered, Richard, if you were, when you showed the pictures of the penguins and they were talking about some of the populations in decline, some of them stable and some of them rising. And, it had climate change and habitat loss and getting caught in fishing nets. It seems like some of these, I'm trying to think of how different the habitats are. It seemed like that, they still have plenty of ice to be on, and they still have, it sounds like enough krill and other things to eat. But I'm wondering if you knew something about the populations, the subpopulations of penguins that are in decline, and what's what about climate change or habitat loss more specifically is doing it to them?
That's a good thought, and I'm glad you brought that up, Paul. Your answer is, to answer you, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. I think the message that I got both from the National Geographic and from science is that it's too early to tell if how much and how rapidly climate change is going to affect this continent and the animals and fish and birds that are there. I think they say the penguins are threatened. They see some of them do better than others. They worry a little bit more about the emperor penguins. One of the things with birds and counting birds that makes it difficult is that here in this country, when we want to check out a bird population, we can send up a drone easily. We can go fly over the area, and if they move from one island to another or from one region to another, they can track that. It's a little tougher to do that. They do have helicopters, but between the weather and the availability of helicopters to track down various populations of birds and penguins, it's really hard. So when they see the emperor penguins move, they're not sure if they're dying off or whether they're just moving. But I think all of them, there's the impression that's clear from the simple mathematics of the populations of krill. You can only harvest with these big megaships that are coming down there. You can only harvest for so long, and the mathematics is going to put you over the top or eventually. And therefore, we have to be careful in making judgments and laws. I'll give you a little example, and this doesn't apply to Antarctica, but it does apply to a fish that probably all of you here know about. I used to really like this fish. It's called orange roughy. Do most of you remember that fish? I remember when our kids were small, and we're talking 20 years ago or more, 30 years ago, we thought that orange roughy was just a really neat fish. And I can show you some slides, but maybe next time in the spring, I'm going to give a talk called Ocean Future. And in this, the fish that's called the orange roughy, that was a marketing term. It was originally called a slime fish. And that's because the lateral line, that is a very important sensory organ in the fish, comes up to around the cheek and around the eye, and it forms these little canals. And that's because it's a bottom feeder, and it gives it increased ability to sense its environment around the head, which is important for it. And anyway, people saw these fish off New Zealand, and they saw that it was related to more tropical fishes, had the same genus. And so they made some conclusions based upon the frequency of this fish, a different species of this fish, same genus, in the tropical regions. And their conclusions were that they had a certain lifespan and they had a certain time to reproduce themselves. And based on those conclusions, they developed a fishing week. And they said, well, you can only harvest so many of these orange roughy at a time, and that should work. But the assumption was that the same things that applied to the tropical variants applied to the orange roughy, and that was not the case. The lifespan of the orange roughy is quite a bit longer. It takes a much longer time to repair a reduced population. And and the fertility rate was much lower. And so it wasn't very long before the orange roughy were all gone. And I don't know if you've noticed, but you don't find them in the grocery store anymore. That population was wiped out. And they're talking now about controlling it, and maybe they'll bring it back to the food stores in limited numbers. But I think it's a perfect demonstration of assumptions made by scientists giving advice to the fishing industry, and so assumptions that are just not valid. And also there's a limit, and we saw it so beautifully with the roughy. I was appalled when I realized that we just can't get any roughy anymore, and I wonder why. And that's why we made the wrong conclusions. And so I think the idea of Antarctica is it is a canary in the gold mine. We need to be there. We need to be monitoring it, because that is a place where climate change is affecting the planet in a sensitive way, and we can be monitoring it there. There are other places, of course, we could go to. If you look at the temperatures in Death Valley, for example, they recently broke some records there. Or if you look at some temperatures in India, and so if you're looking at air temperature, those places are important too. So there are all kinds of canaries in the coal mine. But in terms of low temperatures, in terms of melting ice, in terms of water level rise, Antarctica makes it an important area to study, as well as visit and enjoy I'm just happy to. One of the reasons we didn't go to Antarctica was my wife said, I think we'll just contribute to global warming if we go there. We'll basically be another tourist. And so she made sense to me, even though these discussions were made just when I was starting to get interested in global warming about 15 years ago. And so I agreed with her and we didn't go. But I think that we need to sometimes, I think COVID, if it's telling us anything, it's telling us to slow down and not fly too many places and enjoy magazines like National Geographic, and so we can go kind of in a digital way, learn from one another and enjoy the world around us. I'm glad I traveled as much as I did when I did, but and I'm not saying we shouldn't travel, but we should think a little twice sometimes about the impact we're having on the environment.
I told Richard that I was inspired to look around a little when in talking to him a little bit and getting ready for the talk. And I saw on there's a NOVA program, and I think it's a little less than 2 hours long, and it's called Polar Extremes. And it's this paleontologist traveling to both the Arctic in the North Pole and the Antarctic in the South, and going to those research stations that Richard mentioned, and that, it goes through them getting their equipment and stuff like that. And he goes back hundreds of millions of years to examine the archaeological record. And then there's also some a little behind the scenes look at the photographers and the people who are telling the story and all the things that they had to go through to learn how to survive there while they were making photographs and doing the filming. And so that's a good way to be there. It really did feel like you were getting a little behind the scenes look, but all you had to do is turn on your computer, and I'll send you that link because it's really interesting if you want.
I look forward to that. The National Geographic did have a little story about the underwater photographer too there in the Antarctica area, and all the preparations. It took them hours to get ready. It was a lot of work just to go down for 20 minutes or so. Yeah. So they had to be a really dedicated photographer, those underwater marine photographers. But they demonstrated things. I mean, who would have thought that those emperor penguins zoomed up like that with that compressed air? And never would have dreamed of that if they hadn't taken those movies. It's wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you invited me, Paul. I appreciate you've got a wonderful group of people listening in and asking good questions, and I look forward to visiting with you next week.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Richard, I just had one quick question before you leave. You had that one photo that showed what the topography of was below the ice and snow.
Yes, right.
Is that just a guess? Are they trying to do any kind of experiments to see what life may have been before it froze over, or not at this time? Or, because you showed that one fossil they found. I just was curious if they had found anything on any place else.
No, that was a very recent finding, by the way, that fossil. But what you saw, that slide, was bathymetry based upon gravitational analysis from space. Sometimes the satellites that we have up there really provide a huge amount of information. And so we didn't really know what was underneath East Antarctica as well as West Antarctica very well until that was done. And so that was called GRACE, and the G in GRACE was gravitational, and then the RACE, I've forgotten what they stood for, but that was you can look at the amount of variation in gravity by looking at the density, I suppose, and the change in the actual gravitational pull. It must be pretty sophisticated instrumentation that they have on those satellites that can do that kind of analysis. It's amazing, but it's wonderfully insightful. And they're doing that in Greenland as well. And they've found that, I'm changing subject just a wee bit here, but there's quite a bit of water underneath the glaciers in Greenland. And Greenland is a little higher above the sea than Antarctica is, at least the western part of Antarctica, not necessarily the eastern part. But there's quite a bit of water. Greenland is going to melt long before East Antarctica. And people are thinking about putting down a pipe and sucking up the water because they think it's a lubricant and allows the glaciers to melt into the ocean more rapidly. And they think if they took out the water, that that the glaciers would slow down. And that's a form of what I call geoengineering, possibly a little dangerous, and I'm not sure how effective for the amount of energy that you'd have to spend to drill the holes and suck out the water. But these geoengineers, we're going to hear a lot about geoengineering over the next decade or so. And they're interesting ideas, but we need to be careful, I think, in applying them. But at least the geoengineering there, the research, not the geoengineering, but the research we can do from space is wonderful. And I think it was, I was quite impressed with those bathymetry slides from science. That was a wonderful demonstration of the anatomy of Antarctica.
Thank you.
One more comment on that. You're talking about new ways of doing things that they didn't used to have, with satellites being able to measure distances accurately from space. I wonder if anybody is looking into the rebound of the continent. I mean, if ice melts off of a continent, the continent then, it doesn't have so much weight on top of it, it moves up. And it's clear that on the lands that we've been able to study, you can measure the rebounds as the glaciers melt. And I wonder if that's one technique you could use to estimate how fast the ice was disappearing from, say, both Greenland and Antarctica, is by how fast the land rises as the weight of the ice is going down.
That's a very good point, and they are measuring that. I've not heard of it being done in Antarctica, but I have heard of that question in Greenland, as you probably have too. And they do seem to think that it will rise a little bit. I'm not sure to very much, but compared to the water that'll be lost from it. But I think it is a floating island in that sense. And if you think of continental drift, and so when all that water does come off and ice, yeah, it will probably rise a bit. Probably a small amount, but who knows exactly how much? I just don't know. That's a good point. Well, I look forward to talking to you guys in a week. I'm going to try and make it easygoing. I'm trying to eliminate as much of the technology as I can, and trying to give the positive side of nuclear energy, because we keep hearing the negative. And I think it's a very essential form of carbon-free energy that goes 24/7 in a very safe way. So I'm encouraging you not only to learn, but to pass any information you have along to your families, so that it will be a non-political issue. I think it needs to be something nurtured and cared for as we expand our solar and wind and other renewable energies. I think nuclear should be considered almost a renewable form of energy, because the uranium lasts for a long time. So we'll talk about that next week.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Great job.
Thank you. It is very interesting.
It's a pleasure to talk to you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Good questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're very welcome, Jay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Everybody.
Okay, goodbye. See you next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, Paul, it was really great experience. I really enjoyed your group a lot.
Yeah, thanks for prepping and getting us ready for that. And hopefully you got some good feedback too. And
yeah,
and if I get any comments too, I'll send them along to you.
Okay.
If
And
you have
thank you.
anything that you want us to look at before next week, I can put that aside too.
Okay. might do that. Thanks. I'll look around for something that might help. Good. Okay.
Thanks
Very
a
good.
lot. Have a good
Take
day.
care. Okay. Thanks, and you. Bye-bye.
Thursday.
Right.
Bye-bye.